Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is, wherever you are. Welcome to Beach Walk Blog. Today I want to talk a little bit about pronation and also supination, because you can't talk about pronation without talking about supination, and you can't talk about supination without talking about pronation. Now, I see a lot of people talking about something along the lines of I am a supinator or I am an overpronator. And I want to kind of address this thing of I am a pronator or I am a supinator a little bit. The first thing is that we all pronate and we all supinate. So saying that I am a supinator or I am a pronator, it's like, well, yeah, of course you are, because you're a human being, and if you walk or run, you pronate and you supinate. So saying that I am one or the other is it's a little bit silly, first off. So let's just clear that up. We all pronate, we all supinate. The question is, how much, how quickly, and is it a balanced, controlled movement? Now, what do I mean by that? Is it a balanced, controlled movement? Now, the rate of speed of a movement, how fast it occurs, is a factor in how much force tissues have to deal with. So, if I land with my feet like this, pointing outwards, I'm going to rapidly pronate. Now, what happens if my foot lands like this? My big toe, see where my big toe is, it doesn't stop my knee from going too far forwards. And what should happen is that when my foot lands and my leg rolls and it goes slightly inwards, it goes medially, that is pronation of the foot and the ankle. Now, what stops my knee from going beyond that point is my big toe. However, if my big toe is pointing, or if my foot is pointing out, my big toe is now pointing at 1 o'clock on a clock face, as opposed to 12 o'clock on my clock face now. It's pointing at 1 o'clock or whatever. So what that means is that my medial longitudinal arch, that's the arch that goes down this bit here, is going to have to deal with a rapid change in the force that it has to deal with very, very quickly. Now, that's the first thing. If those tissues have to deal with a rapid change in force, chances are they're not going to deal very well with it because it's so fast. Now, that change in force, or the rate that the force is produced, or the rate at which the force is dealt with, is a big problem. If my foot is pointing straight as I run, it takes time for me to roll through my foot as a thing, right? If my heel hits the ground or my foot hits the ground, it takes time for me to roll over my foot, or for my weight, my center of mass to transfer from behind my foot to onto my foot to past my foot. And that's exactly what it does as we run. We land in front of our center of mass goes over our foot, and then it goes past our foot. Now, if the foot isn't pointing straight, then the structure of the foot is not in the right place at the right time to deal with that force. Okay? If the foot is pointing straight, then what happens is the way that the force travels is from the outside to the inside of the foot. So from outside to inside towards the big toe, and then I roll over the big toe. Hence why we practice this movement and we train this movement in the runner's rehab. So if the foot is pointing outwards, that doesn't occur. We just roll straight over the arch, and the medial arch, that is, the inside of the foot, and we get all of that force going through the arch. And that's not really, and that arch doesn't have a huge amount of support if the foot isn't pointing straight ahead. Now, I know some of you are probably, if you're still listening to this, that is, some of you are probably thinking, well, some of the pros land with their feet pointing out. Yeah, they do. And a lot of those pros, they weigh a hell of a lot less than you or I do. They've been doing it for a lot longer than you or I have, and they've trained their bodies to deal with that force over years and years and years and years and years. And we haven't, basically. They also have really great ability to control their internal rotation. That's the way that the body moves, the hip and the torso moves as they run, as their foot's on the ground. They also land with a backward traveling leg, and when you land with a backward traveling leg, that internal rotation force that you generate by doing that is much, much higher. So the internal rotation that they produce dramatically overpowers any external rotation force that the ground will give them back. They also move through their pronation cycle a hell of a lot faster, and they're actually actioning, they're producing the right force in the right place at the right time. And what we see with a lot of injured amateur runners is they're producing the wrong force in the wrong place at the wrong time. Now, if you are an under-pronator, you're somebody who doesn't pronate very well or enough, that generally means, and you might also think of this as I am a supinator, what you're doing is you're hanging out on the outside of your foot, i.e. when you go through your gait cycle, your knee stays on the outside. It doesn't roll inwards like it should. So you're really lacking hip internal rotation. That's what you're lacking. The thing that all the pros do, that's what you're lacking. Now, this isn't a product of weak glutes. In fact, quite the opposite. This is generally a product of over strong external rotators, the glutes being one of those muscles. Now, you can't fix supination or underpronation or poor internal rotation by strengthening your glutes, because the glutes do the opposite of what you need. So if you're somebody who is a quote-unquote supinator, let's use that term because that's the term that people understand, even though it's technically maybe not correct. Let's just use it anyway. If you are somebody who is deemed a supinator and you're hanging out on the outside of your foot, you're probably, I say probably, you are going to miss toe off, big toe off. What that means is, as your foot rolls, you're either going to hit the big toe and then roll away from it prematurely, or you're just not going to get it at all and you're going to just roll off the outside of your foot, i.e. you're going to load the little toes more than the big toes, and that's not good, because what happens then is you got much more force being dealt with by the outside of not only the foot but also the knee, and you're not going to produce, and I keep saying this, the right force in the right place at the right time. You're going to produce the wrong force in the wrong place at the wrong time because you're producing the wrong movement in the wrong place at the wrong time. And it all comes down to movement. It all comes down to what movements your body's making as you run, which then ultimately brings me back to gait analysis. Why do I do a gait analysis? And I don't want to get too much into that, of course, because we're talking about pronation and supination here. So how do we pronate? Well, first thing we've got to do is we've got to get our bodies, our upper bodies that is, to laterally shift. Okay, so I must get my body to do my shoulders and my torso to laterally shift. And if I get them to laterally shift, what happens is that when I go onto one leg, I naturally pronate. When I shift my torso to the right and I go onto my right leg, I actually create an angle from my upper body down to my foot, which forces pronation. And remember, pronation is a really good thing, right? Pronation it's the thing that helps us to move forwards. Pronation is actually something that is considerably off balance, because what happens is when the foot hits the ground, like this, and then the tibia rolls forwards and goes over like this, I am now off balance because my tibia has just rocked forwards, and it creates this forward motion. And the forward motion then also creates a distinct lack of braking force. And what I want to achieve when I run is a distinct lack of braking force, because braking force is not good. Braking force is not good because it slows me down, right? When I run, I want my foot to land as it's being pulled backwards towards me, which then slingshots me over the top, right? So if I land on a backward traveling leg, I'm already going to be slinging myself forwards. I'm already going to be rolling that tibia to a forward angle. I'm already going to be initiating my pronation cycle, my pronation movement, and everything's going to happen much better. I.e., I'm gonna get the brakes off. I love this section of beach where I live. It's right here. It's just the coolest section. I just wanted to show you that. I don't know, I just love it. So I'm already going to land, and my tibia is just going to rock forwards, which is going to allow me to roll through my foot much better, right? And if I roll through my foot much better, then there's going to be less braking force. It's going to be less. I'm going to be putting the brakes on less, and I'm going to essentially get free speed, right? There's always going to be some braking force because as soon as my foot lands, there's friction on the ground. So if I can minimize that by getting my tibia to roll forwards and my pronation action to occur, then that braking force essentially becomes less. And again, that is something that the pros are really good at. Now, if you're supinating, if you're not pronating and you're supinating, what you're doing is you're actually kind of pushing outwards. You're kind of forcing things outwards, kind of like a speed skater. And if you're forcing things outwards, then you're not going to be pronating very well. Now, the foot is really cool because when my forefoot pronates, i.e. my big toe and the ball of the foot, call it the ball of the foot, the pad, the kind of squishy pad underneath the ball of the foot. So just under here would be the ball of my big toe. When that presses down into the ground because it's loaded with my weight, that's the point where my heel should start to rise. Now, the ball of the foot and the big toe should stay down. It should stay down on the ground as the heel comes up. And what happens in a lot of injured runners is that the ball of the foot actually comes off the ground and they roll outwards towards the little toes. And that could be due to a number of reasons, like limitations in the big toe, what's called hallux limitus, hallux being the big toe, limitus being limited big toe extension. It could also be extremely weak medial arch of the foot, or it could be for any other reason, like for example maybe you've sprained an ankle over your years, and that kind of restriction gets translated through your pronation movement, and it just doesn't happen very well because the muscles on the outside of the leg here, the peroneals, are a part of the pronation movement. Now if you've sprained an ankle, those muscles, they're going to be quite weak, they're going to be quite long, lengthened out, probably very taut, and don't do a very good job of actually pronating your foot, and also keeping that big toe and keeping the ball of the big toe down as you lift the heel up to go through to toe off. So what we get is we get supination of the forefoot. That's an outward rolling of the forefoot, when what we should get is the big toe down and then we roll through the big toe, right? But because of those things, like I said, you'll get a limited action of forefoot pronation, and that's really not a good thing, because that's again going to mean the wrong force in the wrong place at the wrong time. Okay, so these are all things that we work on in the runner's rehab. We have all of these exercises built into the runner's rehab, and we work on those exercises so that we can create the right force in the right place at the right time. And that is what helps us to, run better, basically, create the right forces. Ultimately, if you create the right force in the right place at the right time, then what you've got is a body part that's prepared for the force that you're giving it, or the force it's encountering, rather than a body part that's not prepared for the force that you're giving it or the force it's encountering. So we're having the right body part dealing with the right force, and therefore we tend to negate things like tendinitises and tendinopathies. These kind of things become distant memories, because we're not getting the overload, because we're dealing with the right force in the right place at the right time. Yeah, and that is an action, or that is a function of good movement. So if you prepare your foot to do the right things, that doesn't just mean making the foot do certain things, because it ultimately, that rotational movement comes from the upper body. It works its way through the spine, it works its way down to the pelvis, through to the hip, past the knee, and down through the ankle to the foot, and from the rear foot to the midfoot to the forefoot. And that takes some, what I call, sequencing of these movements. And when we get sequencing of these movements, we get, I'm going to say it again, say it with me, the right force in the right place at the right time. We also get the right movement in the right place at the right time, and then we're prepared for what's going to happen. Okay, so one last thing, the foot must be able, and this is a function of a mobile foot. Now remember, the difference between mobility and flexibility, I said this to somebody yesterday, flexibility is passive, mobility is active. So I don't care how flexible you are, I don't care if you can get your foot behind your head and contort yourself into some kind of circus pretzel. I don't care, because that is not a function of the gait cycle. That movement, or that passive range of motion, is not something that happens when we run. So functional mobility is very, very important, because that mobility is an active movement. It's a powered movement by the musculature in your body. Again, when you are passively creating flexibility, the muscles that are supposed to move and propel that joint are not being used, so it's passive. If you're pulling on your leg with your arms, it's not your leg muscles that are doing that, so it's it's kind of pointless. You got to have active mobility, not passive flexibility. Flexibility is it's kind of pointless. It creates flaccidity, and that's not good. Now, when it comes to the foot, we need to load the foot specifically for the job that it needs to do. Okay, and again, the right force in the right place at the right time must be applied to the foot. Now, things like calf raises, heel raises, that never happens when you run. I'm not saying the heel doesn't come off the ground. What I'm saying is that think of the action of a calf raise, the heel going up, and the body being directly above it when that happens. That doesn't happen when you run. Your center of mass is way past the ball of your foot when your heel comes off the ground. Therefore, your calf, particularly your soleus, is in a very, very stretched out state. And this is one of the reasons why people suffer with such bad cramps, because they're not training the right action in the right place at the right time with the right load. And that is the difference between how we in the sling method train the foot and how other people train the foot, because we don't worry too much about training the gastrocnemius muscle to lift your body, because the gastrocnemius works more when the leg is straight, and as we know in running, the leg is never straight, it's always bent, or at least it should be. And now you know, if you see yourself running and you have a straight leg or an almost straight leg, you now know a part of your running problems probably associated with that. So retraining the gait cycle is going to be really important. All right, I'm gonna make my way back up here. I'm gonna sign off now. So just remember that: right force, right place, right time. Okay, and that is what we do in the sling method. That's probably what you're not doing in whatever I'm going to say method, whatever it is. Probably not following any particular method, probably just randomly doing arbitrary stuff that somebody told you would work and it isn't working, and you need to kind of recognize that it isn't working in order to change. All right, so create the right force, create the right movement in the right place at the right time, and you will tend most likely to not suffer the itises and the opathies that you are suffering. All right, so pronation, supination, we are all pronators and supinators. We all do those movements. It's just a question of how much, and it's a question of what movement is occurring at what point during the gait cycle. And if your feet point out when you walk, look how my feet don't point out. My right foot used to. Okay, when I was very injured, my right foot used to point outwards quite severely, but no more, because I've trained it to not do that. Anyway, have a great rest of your day. Take care. Talk to you soon. Bye bye.